Hello and welcome to this episode of the Society for Anglo-Chinese Understanding podcast. This time I'm joined by Professor Jonathan Stalling of the University of Oklahoma, who tells a 3,000-year story of Chinese poetry.
My name is Jonathan Stalling. I'm a professor at the University of Oklahoma, where I co-direct the Institute for U.S.-China Issues, and I edit a journal called Chinese Literature and Thought Today. I'm curator of special collections that collect the history of Chinese literature into English and other languages. As a scholar, I look at comparative poetry and poetics, and I'm a poet and translator as well. So my life, a lot of different hats, but all of them kind of focus on the relationship of English and Chinese as languages through poetry in particular, and historical kind of contextualizations and so on.
We're here to talk about Chinese poetry, and could you just explain on a fundamental level, how does Chinese poetry tend to differ from poetry in European languages?
Right. Well, let's talk about classical Chinese poetry. When it comes to modern or contemporary, so post 1920s, Chinese poetry functions very similarly to European languages and other languages. Prior to that, it's really different, right? Because it's in fact not a vernacular poetry at all, which is to say it's written in a language that isn't spoken. Its rules are derived from cosmological ideals that are the foundation of political thought and philosophy and health and well-being and city planning, geomancy. All of the information system in pre-modern China is kind of works together in a yin-yang 5-element theory and is packaged really tightly according to some very stringent um, ideas of balance and harmony. All of that's encoded in the classical Chinese poetic forms, especially after the Tang Dynasty. So we can talk a little bit more about it, but if I'm sure your listeners are familiar with haiku, perhaps the Japanese form. We know that there's a syllable count there. We know that there's 3 lines. Each line does something different. But that's a vernacular form as well. So that means it's written in a language that is very similar to what we're speaking right now. Classical Chinese poetry just isn't. It's really alien in many ways. It's extremely interesting to delve into classical Chinese poetry because it's unlike any other poetry in the world. It's the most highly constrained forms.
Given that it's not meant to be read aloud, that is obviously a really fundamental difference from Western poetry.
Well, I would have misspoke if I said it can't be read aloud. In fact, it must be read aloud. It is just that it's a language that isn't spoken as a language. So this might sound kind of strange, right? But think of it, a classical Chinese poem is more like Sudoku. If you're familiar with the math puzzles that came from Japan, where every line has a numerical value that you have to add up. There's vertical and horizontal relationships. So a classical Chinese poem is written vertically with both vertical and horizontal constraints on every single word. And so I'll talk about it maybe in a moment, like really kind of unpack one. But even though the language is not a spoken language, when you create a poem, it's a sonorous event. It is a musical event. Not only are they to be read aloud, they're to be chanted and sung aloud. And the rules that undergird how you compose a classical Chinese poem are also the same rules of how you sing or chant or recite that poem. So it's very much an oral tradition in the sense that it involves the body, it involves voice, it's very social. You compose and chant poems at formal events to christen an important moment, to share deep and important feelings with your friends, colleagues, or your superiors. Right. So it's very verbal, very oral, very musical, but it's not a spoken language.
Yeah, of course. Sorry, pardon me. Got my wires crossed there.
No. That's what I mean by the strangeness, Joe. Like it's a really unusual language because it's written in Chinese characters. When you look at a Chinese poem and you find out how complex they are, with all these different constraints, it feels very much like a game. It feels very analytical. it's so hard to translate them into English or into any vernacular language because it isn't vernacular. So, some hope I've built up some mystery around like what what
Yeah.
these things are. They're very alien to I think all modern language speakers, including Chinese language speakers. Chinese, typical Chinese speaker will have memorized these poems as a child in school, but but it's not the Chinese language as it's spoken in any daily sense, in any dialect.
How did classical Chinese poetry emerge? How did China as a culture end up with this unique form?
Right. So the the first book of recorded Chinese poetry is the Shi Jing, right? The Book of Songs or Book of Poems. That
Mm.
goes back to like 7th, 8th century BC, like really old, right? And these formed the canon of the Confucian classics, one of the great classics that Confucian scholars would have memorized, and commentaries about these poems talk about how good governance listens to the people through the voice of the people, which is encoded in the poems. And so, to be someone capable of being given power over the people, they need to demonstrate their capacity to hear and listen, right? To gather the data from the people to create better governance. So poetry became a very important conduit of information, um, and that retains a really important role throughout Chinese history of good governance, which we could talk about a little later. But that begins the process, right? It's that long ago, 7th, 8th century. And then in the Han, you have the evolution of a kind of new forms. You call it yuefu poems. Uh, they have a little bit more structure to them than do the Shi Jing poems. Let's see, I can maybe even read you one real quick.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic.
So this one is uh, collected in the Songs of the Music Bureau style. It's a quatrain, and so it goes like this: 青青河畔草，郁郁园中柳。莺莺楼上雨，皎皎当窗油。Green, green is the bank's grass. Lush, lush are the willows in the garden. Lovely, lovely is the girl on the tower. Bright, bright is her light through the window. Now you'll hear some things that will be echoes over the next 2,000 years. First of all, the quatrain. It's the most popular form of classical Chinese poetry, especially from the Tang, which is 600 or 700 years later. But you'll also hear like that, green, green is the bank's grass, and lush, lush are the willows in the garden. So that pairing, this is called parallelism, where there's a conversation between the first line and the second line. And there's a relationship in the meaning between green and lush, right? And the grass on the bank and the willow in the garden. So that is called semantic parallelism, which is one of the constraints of classical Chinese poetry. Most forms require some form of semantic parallelism, but there's also grammatical parallelism there. So they have to be in the same part of speech, in the same location in the line, between line and 1 and 2. And then this poem continues with that. Lovely, lovely is a girl on the tower. Bright, bright is a light through her window. And so, again, you get that very tight parallelism of meaning and of grammar. But this is still an ancient classical Chinese poem. It still doesn't have the more sophisticated rules that will emerge in the Tang Dynasty. If we fast forward a few hundred years, we can, let's see, we'll go to a poem by Bao Zhao in the 4th century. Here is a poem called Song of Restoration. 梅花已失艳，朱叶千年色。愿君松柏心，彩照无穷极。Plum blooms light then fade, green reeds do not age. May hearts firm as pine choose light with no end. Right. So here you again hear the parallelism of plum blooms and green reeds. light and fade, or do not age, so fade and age. In the Chinese original, this is not a rhyming couplet. Um, there's a little bit of an off rhyme in the English, but you do hear the semantic resonance between fading and aging and green blooms and or green reeds and plum blooms. But the third line, may hearts firm as pine choose light with no end, you start to see more of a development of an idea in the second couplet. And so the strict parallelism of that ancient form starts to evolve into a two-part structure. The first couplet introduces nature through parallelism. The second couplet introduces some concept or an idea which resonates with that imagery, and in a sense extends and comments upon it. So it has a more sophisticated two-part process. That is then codified in the Tang Dynasty when a few linguists started to realize that classical Chinese poetry had two different kinds of vowels. Think of them as long and short, right? And you could build contrasts. And as I mentioned before, classical Chinese poetry, the rules are derived from ideas that undergird the cosmos, or the universe itself. So as the ancient Chinese used their senses to try to understand the patterns of nature, they discerned the symmetry and balance and harmony in ecologies, and derive from that certain ideas that are embedded in good governance or in the kind of moral, ethical language or codes, as well as aesthetics. And so if you could balance one sound with another sound, then you can create inside the structure of poetry an incredible substrate. Like the words themselves are balancing the sound of long and short. So if you have long, long, the next two sounds will be short, short, horizontally. But Joe, this is the really cool part. Underneath that, like the two words that would be in the second line in the same position would be the opposite, short, short instead of long, long. So you have a perfect balance and counterbalance of meaning, of grammar, and of the vowel length of the word. But what you'll notice is that by the Tang Dynasty, these rules become clearer and clearer, and they continue to be codified such that they can be scaled up across all of the Chinese languages and even into other languages like Vietnamese, Korean, and Japanese. All of them were able to compose these incredibly complicated and complex poetic forms that had objectively followed the same criteria. That's what really makes classical Chinese poetry so extraordinary, is it's this vehicle for human expression of ideas, of feelings of grief and joy and love and loss. But on the other side, it's this deep math, which can be objectively ascertained whether or not a poet follows and has achieved certain levels of balance and counterbalance across all of these different aspects of the poem. That's not a human language that I'm talking about, not like what we're using to communicate right now. That's something really different. And so classical Chinese poetry exists, it really sits outside of what we normally think of language as doing, or what we think of language as being.
And just like I think that might be, I don't want to waylay you into giving an explanation of exactly how classical Chinese works, but I think it might be useful if you're able to just clarify the way in which a classical Chinese differs from modern Chinese in its not the right, I'm trying to think of the right word to put it, because it's not a more restricted vocabulary, but it needs to use less words than a modern Chinese would to make sense.
Yeah, you're right. So I mentioned before that a Chinese speaker today does not speak the language of classical Chinese poetry, and one kind of way of thinking about this is that a Chinese word today is typically polysyllabic, like an English word. It has more than one syllable. And so, like we have university, there's like da xue, it's like two syllables. This idea that you have one word that has two Chinese characters, or putonghua, three Chinese characters for the word Chinese, right? That's longer than the English word Chinese, which is only two syllables long. That is, a modern vernacular language. Classical Chinese, on the other hand, is a modular language where every word is a single syllable represented by a single Chinese character. That is why classical Chinese poetry can be thought of as an interlocking modular design system because every word is independent of every other word. And you can put them into different kinds of arrangements and still make sense and still build really elaborate and beautiful musical patterns and rhythms. So that independence of words being one single syllable is what makes a classical Chinese poem or a classical Chinese text so distinct from a modern Chinese poem or text. In fact, you could say that you know we have to translate a classical Chinese poem into English, right, which is a vernacular polysyllabic language. But so too do Chinese textbooks translate classical Chinese poems into modern Chinese as a polysyllabic vernacular language. And so we think of translation as a problem only for, English, but in fact, if you want to tell a person what a classical Chinese poem means, you have to translate it into a vernacular language.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. And I really I really think that really kind of starts to capture how fundamentally different from any other language Chinese can be, and classical Chinese in particular. And do you think Chinese poetry and Chinese poets are more preoccupied with rules than Western poetry? Because obviously there's like rules and structures in Western poetry, but it's quite interesting to hear you describe the depth of them and the way those rules are being analyzed. Or do you think it's just downstream of the uniqueness and sort of the logic you've described of Chinese poetry that those rules just arise as a result of just how the language is structured?
Yeah, I mean, so in a way, the rules. Well, let me begin with a concept I like to talk about is kind of undergirding all of this, which is gan yin. It means to stimulate and respond or interresonance. And the idea here is that the cosmos is an interresonant, interconnected phenomenon. Not everything resonates with everything. In other words, not every word rhymes with every other word, right? Only frog and log rhyme, not frog and cat. So frog and log belong to what's called a tonglei, or a category of resonance. At the most abstract level, all things rhyme in one of two resonances, yin and yang. If you pull that down further, you get the broad resonances of the five elements: fire, water, metal, earth, and wood. And yet, poetry, you have resonances like between, let's say, celestial bodies, so the sky, clouds, stars, moon, right? And so if you put a poem, you want to use a word in one line, like blue sky, you might use gray clouds in the other. They're opposite of one another, but they still rhyme. They're antithetical rhymes. So that's semantic parallelism that we talked about, right? So when you are writing a poem in classical Chinese, you want to observe the nature of reality coming in resonant categories. And you demonstrate to the reader that you understand that this thing resonates with that thing. The same thing is true of grammar, that a noun is a kind of way to make a word function. And so in your next line, you want that same word in that same position to follow the same part of speech because it functions in the same way. So it's grammatically resonant. And then there is end rhyming that we talked, that you might have heard. There's an AABA end rhyme in a quatrain, typically, for instance, which is really unique to classical Chinese poems. And you can think of what the yin and yang of vowel, the long and short vowels, which in Middle Chinese, had a very distinct durational difference. Today, there's the four tones, which remain relatively wedded to that distinction, but it was way more intense in classical Chinese than it is in modern Chinese. And so that's also kind of resonance. And then if you recall, we talked about how the first couplet of a poem introduced nature, and the second introduced a feeling or an idea. Those resonate as well in a way that a poet must put together very intentionally. And so that's called a qingjing resonance, or an emotion and nature resonance. And then most classical Chinese poems resonate or they rhyme with earlier Chinese poems through allusion and reference. And so that's another level. So that's 5 levels of rhyming that a classical Chinese poem after the Tang Dynasty would be required to do. Now, all of this is done often spontaneously. So you have to write vertically and horizontally the poem at the same time, thinking about what comes next as well as what comes above and below. You have to think about all those constraints. But as you asked, like, is it more constrained than English or other forms? Where does that how do we think about that constraint? I would try to flip it around and say that these aren't necessarily poetic constraints. They're understood to be the laws that govern reality. And that a good steward of human resources is someone who understands those patterns and can put language into those patterns. It demonstrates one's discernment that you can pay attention to, listen to, find those resonances, and then put them together in a form that is perfectly balanced. If you can do that in a poem, then it suggests you can do that in other parts of your life or in public life in particular. Right. So this is a very different sense of formalism than you get in the sonnet or right in the English. We rhyme and we have meter, but we don't have a reason why we have rhyme or meter. It's not connected to a cosmological set of principles that undergird, these other structures of society and culture. And so that's a massive difference between the two. And I think one of the reasons what make classical Chinese poetry so fascinating.
Yeah. It's interesting you said you compared it to the laws of nature, or I think you said it was the laws of nature that things should be structured in that way. What's sort of the philosophical ideas behind that? Where's that coming from?
Right. Yeah. So this notion Ganying that I mentioned before, right, could be because even potentially before the written word in China, some scholars have theorized that the wise men and shamans were blind, which is one reason why you see as much musical theory and pitch pipes and other forms of musical ritual undergirding statecraft language rather than the vision-centered that you get in sort of Christian or even in Buddhist language. So the fact that sound is so important is why I think we end up getting a set of metaphors that are based on resonance and interresonance. And then, this is not that man can control nature, but that nature follows certain principles. And so if we can understand those, two things are possible. One is we can regulate our own bodies through Chinese medicine by following those principles of balance and counterbalance to prevent illness. In society, you can, again, try to prevent extremes by moving toward that middle path of balance and counterbalance and harmony as principles. And then in a worldview wherein the human world and the immaterial world were opaque but interconnected, this idea of heaven's mandate or that the political affairs were connected to things like drought or floods and so on could also suggest that there's a certain idea of human agency. It's not to plow our own path, but we do have the agency to attune ourselves to larger cosmological ecology. And if we do that well, we're positioned to be good curators of human relationships and stewards of human resources. So it's about trying to understand how nature works and then attuning us to that rather than, trying to just plow our way through, as it were. Now, I did say this is, these are laws of nature. It's important to note that when the 19th century ended and China was falling under colonialism like much of the world, and the Qing dynasty was collapsing, this worldview was not providing the scientific, instruments and measurements and methodologies that allowed for technological innovation at the speed of the Western powers. And as such, when the modernists came in the 20th century, who were themselves poets, they chose to essentially throw the baby and the bathwater out at the same time. That this worldview was endangering Chinese people's lives, the Chinese nation itself. It needed to modernize like Meiji Japan was and bring in Western science and methods and evidence, and that the five-element yin-yang theory was insufficient, for a modern nation state under these exogenous or external forces. And so classical Chinese poetry, which was so important all the way through to the early 20th century, kind of fell to the wayside as a diagnostic for someone who is going to be given the reins of power. But this is, this is just, I just want to impress upon your readers that when we're talking about Chinese poetic forms, we get to talk about a lot. We get to really open up and think about a different epistemology and ontology, a different way of thinking about the world, the human relationship to nature, and what it means to cultivate yourself as a human being, what it means to become a good person. And poetry was an incredibly important diagnostic, but also a kind of practice, perhaps the central practice, because it was a public mirror of your inner world. And you can demonstrate to others that you understand these patterns and put the very substrate of intelligence itself, which is language, into those patterns. While talking about joy and grief and love, right? I mean, all the stuff, all the goodies that poetry does.
Yeah. I think there's a really interesting contrast there, because you made the point about how the people who wanted to modernize China at the end of the Qing dynasty and when China became a republic, they saw changing poetry and changing the way of writing something that had to be changed as well. And I think that's an interesting contrast with, if you look at like the Renaissance in Europe, and there's always been a tendency to look back to classical forms, and like the idea that that the way to kind of modernize a society almost is to look back at the ancients and the Greeks. And that's something that's happened in cycles over Europe's and the West's, more generally, history. Why do you think they felt that poetry was entangled with China's material conditions? Do you think that poetry has more of a religious philosophical role in classical China than poetry might have had in the European context?
Yeah, is a great question, and I think the best way to answer it is to jump into the Keju, the imperial exam. If your listeners will recall, when we were going through those early classical Chinese poems, I talked about how each few centuries new rules would be added and new refinements until the moment when those linguists discovered that all words were either a yin tone or a yang tone, right? A long or a short vowel. And once that was standardized, rhyming dictionaries were created. And the rhyming dictionaries were important in China because everyone spoke different dialects. And so a Chinese character, represents a syllable of Chinese. But how you pronounce that syllable of Chinese depends on what dialect you speak. Chinese is a family of language. There are hundreds of dialects, and you could almost say languages within the Chinese language system. And so a rhyme dictionary allowed for everyone, regardless if they're a northerner or a southerner, to look at a reference book and say, okay, this word rhymes with that word. There were other books, encyclopedias, that would suggest what rhymes semantically, like what those parallelism rhymes were, right? So all these poetry manuals and different handbooks were starting to proliferate through China. What this meant was that everyone could write the same poetry with the same rhyme, even if they spoke different languages. But again, remember, this is not a spoken language. Classical Chinese isn't spoken by anyone, so it doesn't matter what your mouth says a rhyme word is. It's what the reference material. So these rhyme tables and rhyme dictionaries allowed for a codification of all of the rules, such that in the Tang Dynasty, when the imperial exams were created, such that anyone with means could study for and take this exam. And if you pass through the 5 gates of the exam, you would be able to enter into the imperial bureaucracy at a very high level. And so the top kind of, in the Tang Dynasty anyway, and on and off throughout dynastic China, the top skill of that exam was writing regulated Chinese poetry, right? Classical Chinese poetry. And the fact that these rhyme tables and rhyme dictionaries were there meant that that could be shared not only across all of China, but also in Vietnam, where the exam system moved, to Korea, and briefly, but very importantly, in Japan as well. And so in Korea, for instance, there's 1,000 years where if you are a yangbang, if you're like an important ruling class Korean, you will have also learned how to write classical Chinese poems, and you would write them in classical Chinese according to the rhymes of classical Chinese, even though you're a Korean speaker. So we're just trying to get the sense that this important relationship between classical Chinese poetry and an exam system, which created this meritocracy that lasted from 600 AD, right, the birth, or even before then, in late Sui dynasty, but the birth of the Tang dynasty, all the way to the 20th century, that poetry skills were at the root of the exam culture. Not just the exam, but the culture of becoming a wenren, a literati, a bureaucrat, meant that you knew how to compose classical Chinese poetry. In that sense, I think we get the answer to your question, Joseph, right? Which is, if the Hu Shi, say, modern poets, or Lu Xun, the great prose stylist of the modern period, when they looked at classical Chinese poetry, they didn't see poetry. They saw a technology, a kind of cosmological technology rooted in the imperial exam system, inside the imperial information system, which had catastrophically failed to protect China against the encroachments of Western colonial powers. As such, they weren't just feeling like they were culturally connected, they are at the root connected to one another. And so, in order to move China forward, the first place that needed to move was poetry. And so Hu Shi and Lu Xun and these others, they were the fathers of modern China, and they were poets because they were bringing in vernacular Chinese, writing free verse. One of the great ironies is that, our own shift from rhyming and metered poetry of the 19th century into the 20th century was through Ezra Pound, who, like you suggested, many other Western poets looked to ancient models to find modern pathways. And so he looked to classical Chinese poetry. But in his translations, they weren't metered and rhymed, right? So he could just see information there. And it was without the fluff of romanticism. And he felt it was a more scientific and more materialist form of poetry. And so it was really catalytic and giving birth to English modernism in both England and in America. But for the Chinese modernists, it was an existential battle between two paradigms, that which they were trained in as children, which had failed, and that which they needed to invent, which was the idea of an author who expresses an individual sentiment through vernacular language. And that gives rise to notions of democracy and of literacy of the people using the language of speech to write information and share it with one another. All of this was completely radical at this, because classical Chinese poetry was just so ensconced. It was such an important piece of that ancient world. So, it's one of the great stories, I think, of nation building, is this poetry battle that sits kind of at the heart of what it means, in some sense, to be Chinese, and what it means to be a modern nation state. And yet it created these two streams of Chinese poetry, the classical Chinese poetry and the modern Chinese poetry, which don't dovetail too much. They do occasionally in some poets, but more or less they're completely different ecosystems.
Yeah. I think that's so interesting, like poetry as an existential matter, a real matter of life and death and national preservation, I think is something that's quite hard for people, certainly for me in the West, to get to grips with.
No, I just totally agree. I think it's
Yeah.
wonderful. For those of us who believe poetry matters, and it does matter, but it matters for most of us in a modern sense. It doesn't matter in the way that it did matter in dynastic China, nor does it matter today in China in that same way.
Could you just explain how did poetry get to that exalted position, that position of career importance? Because that, I think, is something quite hard for me as a Westerner, coming from a 21st century Western perspective, which is about as far as you can get psychologically from a classical Chinese perspective. How did it get into that position
Right.
in the
Yeah.
examination system?
So, in the exam system, a lot of it is memorization of like the four classics of Confucianism, and so it is a fill in the blank kind of exam at some level. There is also an essay written in different forms. And by the end of the Qing dynasty, it was in the Baguwen, which is the eight-legged essay, which is maybe around policy of some kind, where you were given a policy question. But the eight-legged essay was basically an extension of a classical Chinese poem. So it was written in classical Chinese, non-vernacular Chinese. It followed many of the same rules that a poem follows, and so that is important to note. But I just want to suggest that it's not a poetry test by itself, right? But within the exam system, poetry sits at that most exalted skill, and it could not have happened had two things not probably happened beforehand. One of which was the Book of Songs, which we talked about, right, from the 7th, 8th century BCE. That idea that someone in power needs to be able to listen to the people, and that poetry speak for the people. That's really an important precedent, that poetry is important for governance and information, as a conduit of information. The second is the convergence of cosmological ideas and linguistic design. Because of the interlocking modular design system of classical Chinese poetry, you can build this incredible diagnostic that can test a person whether or not they understand how to create balance and symmetry and counterbalance and harmony across all these different vectors of a poem. So it's an intelligence exam. It's also a diagnostic of whether or not you understand the governing rules of the empire that undergird all the other information systems. And so it's the most clean, clear, kind of transparent, condensed form of one's demonstration of understanding these basic ideals. And then this notion of a Confucian gentleman being someone who undertakes a form of self-cultivation through observing the world, understanding how it works, and then putting those rules, into to work in oneself. And so when we're talking about balance, counterbalance, and harmony, what better way to demonstrate that we have put ourselves in order than to create a poem that is deeply personal, sometimes private, intimate, as a poem is. It's an expression of a very singular person, place, and time, in a format that demonstrates their mastery of all of these other rules. That would be proof that one has essentially undertaken self-cultivation. And so there's a moral and ethical dimension to the public mirror that poetry creates. Whether or not this poetry test created better bureaucrats is contested, obviously, and was from the very beginning. It's not an open shut case. You have people who argue that this is a superfluous skill and that bureaucrats should be trained in more practical things and matters. But nevertheless, it's deeply embedded in statecraft from the Tang through the Qing. And if you look at Korea, we're talking about, the last dynasty was almost 1,000 years old. Like it's an incredible period. So if you are, China is a very big place, even Korea, separated by mountain ranges. And each of those different places speak different dialects, and each of them have powerful warlord families who can contest for central power. What would you prefer the most ambitious young men do? Prepare martial skills, or prepare for a poetry exam that demonstrates self-cultivation to become a good person by creating a space in yourself that can reflect the natures of the nature of nature itself, right? This sense that a person has wisdom in it or in them, like that probably led to more, like just tremendous less bloodshed across East Asian history. This is in Vietnam, Korea, and China, because simply this is where and how people competed with one another, how one clan competed, how one region competed, was in these exams and in poetry, a kind of poetry battle, if you will, that people really took very seriously. So just in so far as it being a great way to interpolate or to make a subject of an empire feel like they are finding a higher path to being a better human being through learning these rules and regulations and then finding beauty and aesthetic meaning in them and personal expression at the same time. You can see how powerful as an ideological tool it was, but also just I think in practical terms, it worked. It worked to keep an otherwise very unruly part of the world far more peace loving than I think you would have found if you had other forms of competition.
Yeah, I think that's so useful to think about because kind of in like the popular imagination of like classical China, there's a lot of focus on like legalism, for example, and the idea that order is maintained through the harshness of its punishments. But that was only quite a short spell of Chinese history, a very short spell of Chinese history in the scope of things. And it's really useful to think about the idea of the role of poetry and self-cultivation in preserving peace in the largest country in the world. I think that's a really useful thing to highlight. I wonder, is there anybody who's still writing classical Chinese poetry? Is there anyone who's in modern China that you know of who's tried to revive the form or doing anything
Yeah.
interesting in that area?
Okay, so this is such a great question because it's two questions and they're divergent answers. The first one is anyone doing it? And the answer is more people are doing it now than at any point in Chinese history, right? Because the internet and different clubs and so on, where people are writing and sharing classical Chinese poems, the rules are available to anyone. Even though this is not a spoken language, Chinese characters have remained relatively stable. The phonology of Chinese has changed such that it's difficult to map modern Chinese pronunciation onto those rules in Mandarin, but in Cantonese and Fujian dialect, Suzhou dialect, and others, Shanghai, some of these can be mapped fairly closely. So lots of people doing it. Then the second part of your question was, do I know anyone doing it? And what's so interesting about this is the answer is no. I mean, I do, but that's just because I'm quirky that way. It's important to say that there are no famous classical Chinese poets. So this is where it's so different from the 19th century to the present because the cultural capital or the prestige capital of poetry went to new poetry, right, through Hu Shi. The most, I'll ask you, who's the most famous 20th century Chinese poet? Chairman Mao.
Oh, of course, yeah. No,
Yeah,
of course,
Chairman
yeah.
Mao, right?
Absolutely.
So, he wrote Jueju in his ci form, which is a Song Dynasty lyric, but it's a regulated verse form. It does all that stuff that we were talking about, all those hard constraints. Like he did that, but he more or less forbid anyone else from doing it. But Mao was a very accomplished poet and has to be considered an important one. But most, if not all, of his work that's memorized and known today are in classical forms, which is really distinctive. So outside of Mao, whose people still memorize and recite today, there are very few in the 20th century who are known. And in terms of contemporary writers, not so much. Now, if you look into the calligraphy world, where you have a famous calligrapher, they can compose their own, regulated verse or jueju, and and write it in their personal style, like that kind of thing. They may be well known within certain circles. Yeah, but so different, right? I mean, they're just it's pervasive. People know classical Chinese poetry. They've memorized it. They see it. It's ubiquitous. You see it everywhere on buildings, on menus, at restaurants, right? But it's so everywhere. I think sometimes we forget how alien and strange and how powerful it is. In fact, every single quatrain, Jueju, you see represents this world where the form meant so much, and held so much prestige and power. I always wonder whether it will again. I think AI really troubled that possibility. Some of the first AI systems, computer, just generated text in China through algorithms was to try to crack classical Chinese poems, even in the 90s and aughts. That was, something that algorithms were working out because of that interlocking modular element. It was a really great challenge. And AI is quite good at it because it does follow all these rules. So I think that's kind of troubled things a bit for the form, as with formalism in other languages. Now, I will say, I hope all of your listeners will learn to write classical Chinese poetry themselves in English. English is the only other language outside of Chinese, Vietnamese, Korean, and in some sense Japanese that can compose classical Chinese poetry. You'll wonder, like, how is that possible?
Yes,
But
I am
it's just
wondering.
math. Yeah, it's just math. The root of a classical Chinese poem is a single syllable word. Only English and Old Scots. Old Scots has about 4,000 of these words. English has 8,000. The vocabulary of a Tang Dynasty poetry is around 14,000. So we have a smaller infinity of poems that can be written in English than can be written in classical Chinese. But it is in many ways a better language than modern Chinese because it participates in all of the same phonological rules as classical Chinese. So, that's for your readers to discover, but I would point you to juejupath.com. But actually, I've for about 12, 15 years, I've run a worldwide competition in classical Chinese poetry in English called the Newman Prize for English Jueju. And the UK, now, for like the last 6 or 7 years, the UK has probably entered more poetry than any other country. St. Paul's Girls' School, shout out to those girls in London, really are the reigning champs of English Jueju in the world, probably, in terms of how many medallions and prize money they've brought back. Their regulated verse skills are serious. And so this is, again, Newman Prize for English Jueju. And it's, about 10 different countries participate in this competition. And because it can be done, all the same rules are applicable to monosyllabic English as classical Chinese, it means Chinese students in high school, middle school, college, as well as adults compete with those in England, America, Europe, and elsewhere, Russia, different countries, in a way, that kind of replicate the old Confucian exam system, that it's a public competition and diagnostic. So if you go to juejupath.com, the learning platform is organized like the Chinese imperial exam, and has an AI that I trained. No other AI can actually do English regulated verse. I'm very happy about that. The constraints are thus far not solved on any, Claude AI, OpenAI. None can do it, but mine is proprietary. And so my language model will give you feedback, and it will pass you through all the gates of the exam until you get to the Jinshu level. And when you do, I will judge that poem, and if I deem it worthy, you're granted Jinshu status, and you get to vote on who wins the global prizes in the Newman Prize. So it's a really fun project, and has been used in UNESCO for U.S.-China diplomacy and other things for a number of years. It's just so much joy to, for your listeners, if any of what I talked about sounded opaque and strange, it should, because it's such a big world and it's so different. But it only takes about 25 minutes to get your basic skills, and you learn it from the inside out. Once you write a regulated Jueju in English, you'll be like, okay, I get it. And we're talking about 12-year-olds, that just nail this in an hour or two, and it's the highest, most difficult, exam skill, in the imperial exam. But the basic rules are so objective and so clear that you can trust them. And then making a good poem is harder, obviously, to say something with grace and wisdom, authenticity, but some of the greatest poems, that I receive every year, are written about deeply held, deeply felt things, grief of family members passing, things of that level. Jueju, this quatrain form of classical Chinese poetry, is built to house all human sentiment, and it has a home for it, and it creates harmony, and it situates it, in this balanced and counterbalanced home that is a good house for even our hardest thoughts and as well as most intimate hopes. It's, once you really enter the classical Chinese poetic universe in your own language, I think you really start to feel, okay, I get it. It's hard for me to explain. My apologies for coming at it
Yeah.
somewhat opaquely, because it is so different, right? But I hope maybe I should have begun with this, that
Yeah.
go try it out for yourself. Learn to write a Jew, then listen to this podcast again.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I'll definitely put a link to that in the show description because such a fantastic project. Just a little note you mentioned. You mentioned because which I thought was quite interesting was that Mao Zedong wrote his poetry in classical Chinese, and you'd
Mm.
earlier mentioned that a lot of the modernists at the time, and I suppose he was writing his poetry in the 1920s or maybe a bit later or earlier than that, were rejected the classical forms because they thought it was holding China back. And I think it's so interesting that Mao, who is a modernist in some ways and a Marxist-Leninist in some quite fundamental ways, would choose to write in the classical forms. Like, do you have any thoughts on what was going on there?
Yeah, well, I mean, two things. One is, when you read the poems, they're lionizing the those who are, guerrilla, fighters, right? During the Civil War, talking about tactics which he's employing, and so content wise, you'll hear a familiar voice in the poem, right? But the form, to your point, is this classical form. It is. I'm not published on this. I'm probably not the right person to ask about why he would necessarily feel not just free to write in these forms, but that it was a good idea, right? To write in the forms, given his Yan'an talks on literature. What if you read them? They're all about this kind of Marxist realist vernacular, proletariat directed, mass literacy oriented artwork and poetry. It's meant to be poetry for the people, by the people, and in that sense, inculcating a proletariat consciousness, in the peasantry and in this agrarian society that didn't pass through what Marx describes, in this sense of different periods or epochs. So Maoism itself, is probably most clearly articulated in those Yan'an talks on literature. But those were about other people writing, whereas he himself didn't follow the rules he was laying out for the cadre to write in. And so I think that probably speaks to the fact that both his calligraphy as well as his poetry were the emblems of a dynastic leader. That form of cultivation being a public record of his, of his ability to have imbibed and be a modern conduit of these forms of cultural authority, that could give people some assurance that he was to be, to have the heavens mandate to rule, because these would be the earlier kind of diagnostics for that. So I think there's, you can kind of I think there's a lot of reasons why he might have chosen to write in the forums, but my guess is this, is that many people who were trained in these, and your readers, or sorry, your listeners, again, that you all can totally understand this after learning to write yourself. Once you learn what these forms do and you feel what it feels like for another person to read your poem and to acknowledge the level of excellence that it's risen to at an objective as well as subjective level, that form of camaraderie, that form of friendship, which is called zhiyin, or to hear and know one another's resonance, that is something everyone grieved, in the modern Chinese nation state, the loss of that form of sociality. And so I think that there's also just a something there that is, a gift to everyone, that they can, that they have his zi that they can memorize, a kind of tethering to the old world. But I think for him, it just feels so good. I mean, when you earn the skills, and you can't use them, as many of them couldn't, that was really, to be estranged from some deep part of yourself. And I think that you'll feel like even Lu Xun, who wrote Diary of a Madman, right? That wonderful short story in vernacular Chinese for the first time, breaking the mold. He was an exquisite writer of the Zi form as well, which is a highly regulated, difficult form of classical poetry. So, and yeah, so I don't have an easy answer there. There's a lot of reasons to think that he would do it because he could do it.
He was just he might have just been flexing.
Yeah, like a good reason to suggest that might be possible.
As we've said, Chinese is a tonal language, and those single character syllables can encode a lot more information than a single syllable would in another language. Can you talk a bit more about the challenge that presents to a translator?
Yeah. Translation has been a really wonderfully contested field. But before I answer that question, I want to say something that I think really surprises people. Chinese poetry did not move between languages through translation until the last 150 years. For 2,000 years, it changed languages so that the language itself could, at scale, create and transmit classical Chinese poetry. So Vietnamese, Korean, and Japanese were all retrofitted so that they were a conduit for the classical Chinese form and could participate in all of its rules. Therefore, you didn't translate, you simply read the poem in your own language, which has been adjusted to allow for you to directly read the poem or compose one of your own. So the idea that translation is the way that information moves between languages is the anomaly here. It's a latecomer, and it's not the best way to do it, which is why English, because it has this magical, mathematical, unlikely, similarity to classical Chinese, is one of those languages that you can just bring it over entirely as a system. However, they sound strange because it's only single syllables, and there's no English verse form with only single syllable words in them. There's like no earlier form like that. So let me, kind of give you a sense of let's do a couple things here, maybe toward the end, right? One is let's hear a classical Chinese poem as it's meant to be heard, which is not the way I've been reading them, but to be chanted out loud. Then let's hear a kind of typical English translation, and then let's hear a classical Chinese poem in English. All right, so this is a poem by Li Bai. It's a jueju. It's a ping start regulated jueju, which means it's going to start with two words that are elongated in their sound. And then right under that, in the first two words of the second line, are going to be super truncated. And so you can hear this as I chant the poem. Some words are going to stretch out really far. Some words are going to be really quick and direct. And that is embedded in the poetic form. That's the rules of the poem. And so the recitation style draws from those rules and expand them into a form of performance, which is called yin song. And so here's the poem. 朝辞白帝彩云间，千里江陵一日还。两岸猿声听不住，轻舟已过万重山。All right, so this poem would be translated something like this. From the city of Baidi, we leave at dawn under multicolored clouds. The journey to Jiangling is 1,000 li, and yet we'll make it in a single day. From both sides of the river, monkeys or apes call without end. And yet from our small boat, we've already passed 10,000 miles. So as a vernacular English poem, I think it's quite beautiful. The imagery's rich, concise. There's movement. Time and space is operating at a level that really offers a kind of surprise, right? Like long journey happens instantly. Like there's this plaintive calling of nature through the apes crying out. There's a buoyancy in the small craft with these huge cliffs around them as they sail down the white water of the Three Gorges. I mean, come on, it's a gorgeous poem in English as vernacular English, right? But in Chinese, you heard it. I mean, it's a musical event. It has a whole nother level of embodied meaning in the sonorous qualities and the plaintive elongation of of the syllables, of the abruptness of some lines, and these perfectly contrasting positions that once you're familiar with the form, you'll hear it all and it'll all become legible. Like, oh yeah, that's a representation of this part of that poem. So as you become literate in the form, the oral reception of the poem takes on all these new meanings. Right? And so that completeness, is possible in English as well. So here's a poem. I wrote this one in Suzhou last summer in Changlangting, which is one of the Suzhou's UNESCO gardens. And I'll read it first, and then I'll chant it. So, aged walls, close lake, slick curved eaves, old gates, far hills, long thick leaves. By lamps, Dufu could not sleep. Who could, with sweet scents like these? Now, the poem has all 5 levels of rhyming in it. It is a poem about a poem inside the garden. So there's a couplet, a very famous couplet inside the garden that talks about how the architect of the garden has taken the lake, which is nearby, as a part of the garden simply by making it visible from within the garden. So it's like you can claim that lake because it's close to you, right? And then it also had view of the distant hills. So you had the water element and the hills element for free. So it's kind of a joke couplet because it suggests that this was a sort of thrifty design of the garden. Then you move from there to the third line. By lamps, Dufu, the great Tang Dynasty poet Dufu, he couldn't sleep. And there's a line of poetry in the Hall of Fragrant Plum Blossoms that has this line about Dufu being unable to sleep because of the smell of those plum blossoms. So my Jueju is referencing this. Now, aged walls is the first 2 words. Aged walls against old gates, close lake against far hills, slick curved eaves against long thick leaves, and so on. So I'm using grammatical and semantic parallelism, and I'm also using the same long and short vowels, which we don't have time. If your listeners are interested, when you go to juejupath.com, you can learn how the short and long vowels work in English in the same way that they do in classical Chinese. But that all is there. And so I composed this poem on the spot, following all of these rules as a part of my journey I was taking in Suzhou at the time and in Nanjing and in Jiangsu province, writing a classical Chinese poem spontaneously based on whatever location I was at. Because there's a performance art to Jueju, because once you've learned the interlocking modular design of all of those rules, they become so part of you that you can actually pull them out, even drunk, which is often the case because you're doing it in a banquet setting, and you can deliver a poem that is so beautiful and so perfectly orchestrated to really demonstrate, that you would be the kind of guy who should be getting a promotion because you're doing that in the like of your betters. Right. And so that notion of this kind of performativity of the poem, the localness of it, the socialness of it, that was part of the constraints. So here's the poem. I'm going to chant it to the same melody as before. So, eh, age walls, close lake, slick curved eaves, old gates, far hills, long thick leaves. By lamps, Du Fu could not sleep. Who could with sweet scents as these? Right? So I myself, this is not a poem, I happen to have it close at hand, so I read this one. I needed to talk about the nature of how it was composed because actually I don't love this poem. English is capable of a lot more idiomatic expression and expressivity in monosyllabic words than this one has. But when you have 6 constraints, 6 different vertical and horizontal constraints, and you're doing it impromptu, you're going to be kind of having to make some concessions. And that's why this became gamified. In the Ming and Qing dynasty, people played card games that were about regulated verse. Drinking games were regulated verse. Courtesan culture, courtship between women and men in the cities, regulated verse games, right? This is a way of connecting to people. And that sociality of the form, because it's objective rules, create the playfulness and this kind of beauty that connects people not only with one another, but connects poems to poems hundreds of years ago or thousands of years ago. In that sense, so when I talked about Chairman Mao or Lu Xun, like feeling a kind of part of themselves missing, that writing a classical Chinese poem, if you know how to do it and don't do it, it or couldn't do it, it was like taboo. That sense of estrangement to something that's so beautiful and so rich. That's also the seat of power and the gateway through which you have to enter. Even if you're a wealthy family, you don't get to just join the government. You have to pass through this gate, and it is going to test your grace and your intelligence. It's going to look at your emotional maturity and your capacity for wisdom and compassion, all this stuff, right? For Buddhists, for Confucianists, oh, come on. It's so cool. So I really hope that, that your listeners will take that invitation to try out the form and share it with others.
No, that was so fantastic and such a good way of kind of capturing how, for an English-speaking listener, how classical poetry worked. I was really delighted you went with Li Bai because it was actually reading Arthur Cooper's translation of Li Bai and Du Fu's poetry that got me interested in Chinese poetry initially. So I was really happy to hear Li Bai and Du Fu mentioned on the podcast.
I would not be a good guest if I didn't mention Li Bai and Du Fu in a podcast about classical Chinese poetry.
Something I find quite interesting is how so many historically significant figures in Chinese political history, from Cao Cao in the 2nd century AD to Mao Zedong, who we've already discussed in the 20th century, have written poetry, and that this poetry has come down to us today and continues to be read, sometimes maybe for historical interest, but sometimes too for its own merits. Do you have any theories? I think we've kind of touched on it already. I think the reader may also already have some idea based on what you've just been saying. Why that is, why there doesn't seem to be an equivalent in the West of poetry as something that people who consider themselves people who are historically important don't seem to be writing poetry or don't seem to be writing anything of the same equivalent in the West. Mm. So a bit of a confused question.
Yeah. So no, not at all. It's a great question, and it's important. Okay, so if you think about classical Chinese poetry as the Shi Jing suggested, as a conduit of information from the people to those who in power, there's another important piece of this, which is that when you're a bureaucrat and you want to signal to an emperor or someone above you that there's a problem in their policy, you can embed that illusion in a poem. And in that poem, if it's not too straightforward, is a good way to encode that message such that the population at large doesn't hear it. Right, so it's a kind of cipher that you can transmit information to critique power from a position of a bureaucrat, middle position of power. And so poetry in that sense is a really great conduit of information up. But let's say you're an emperor and you're reading a poem. You need to know if that poem is overly critical of your rulership, right? Like, if it is, you need to take action and execute, or send them to the gulags, right? So you need to send them to the boonies where they can essentially not cause any more trouble, which happened all the time to Chinese bureaucrat poets because they were too straightforward, perhaps, in their criticism in a poem. But this is my point is this, is that an emperor needed to be able to read poetry for themselves. They can't rely only on, those around them to interpret poems and give them, this information. They would have needed to do it themselves. So they have agency to understand what the the imperial bureaucracy was saying and behind their backs or whatever. So in that sense, that's an important part. Um, but it doesn't mean that this poetry is good. I also want to mention that Qianlong Emperor from the Qing Dynasty, 17th century, wrote something like 40,000 poems. I can't recall. That are still existent, many of them, and almost none of them are considered good. Certainly none of them are anthologized, and yet he kept writing them. And I think part of it is the ludic, the gamified feeling of the poem, the pleasure principle of what's called kuyin, or bitter chanting, which is when you are dealing with an interlocking design system like this, it means you change one word. Oh, I need to change another word over here to balance that one. Oh, wait, now that one threw this one off. I need to change that one. I need to say it out loud so I can hear whether my tones are contrasting or not, right? So this process of that is really rich and fun. And so I think that's also why the emperors would have learned. So you have power for all these various reasons, whether it's self-cultivation in a true ethical sense of the juren, of the gentleman, or if it is to decode information that's sent up the chain of command through reading poetry properly and accurately to discern those hidden messages, or to transmit them yourself. Or whether it's just the joy of it, and the sociality of poetry, which I mentioned is so important. So all those stuff, this is all to say, it's really a very special ecology. It just doesn't exist outside of China, right? And so I think, as with many of these things, we have to kind of, not, I don't just mean China, I mean East Asia, right? Again, that did exist to a certain extent in Vietnam and in uh, Korea, and lesser so in Japan. As we get to the West, we find there are, like within negritude, Césaire or others, there are examples. Within Eastern Europe, there are examples. Within Persian culture, there are examples. Where power and poetry align very closely with one another. I think within, less so within Russia, but there are traditions, there as well where poetry is elevated in various times in various ways. So it's not that I think we see it threaded throughout world history and throughout different languages, but China's is so, and these technologies, these cosmotechnics of classical Chinese poetry is so distinct that I don't think it becomes an apple and an orange.
Yeah.
I believe in ways that we just, they're really uncomparable.
Yeah.
And it's almost not fair to talk, because when we switch to other languages, we're talking about vernacular poetry. High Persian is not exactly vernacular. So that being the case, often in the way that it's enjoyed is in vernacularized versions of that, the ghazal and other forms that are coming, coming out in vernacular ways. So yeah, I don't know. That's my answer, though. As wandering as it is that China's East Asia is a very particular case because of the uniqueness of these poetic traditions.
Can we talk now about how modern Chinese poetry emerged and how that break, which we've already mentioned briefly, from classical Chinese poetry took place?
Yeah, great. Okay, so it does, like I said, it kind of began. Interestingly, it begins in the United States with Hu Shi, who's after the Boxer Rebellion is put down. There's a fund that's established that allows for some intellectuals to travel from China to the United States. Hu Shi comes to Columbia University in New York, where he studies under American pragmatists and kind of gets an introduction to a variety of political theory and thought, as well as kind of current literature trends. And so he returns and writes a treatise, a manifesto, where he delivers like 8 don'ts. Don't use meter. Don't don't use rhyme, don't use allusion, don't use parallelism. I mean, it's all the things we just said do. He said don't do, right? And that connects to this May 4th movement and the kind of new youth movement and so on, where you see the both the start of republicanism and democracy, as well as Marxism, what would then extend into the current state. So that was deeply connected, right, between English and Chinese, because some of the models for Husher was that he's kind of getting is there. Now, for Lu Xun, he's in Japan. Japan, of course, also in the Meiji period is a lot of westernized academia, access to different literature. Later on, it's Russian literature plays a big role in the mid-century. As a catalyst for new ways of writing and thinking about Chinese. But over the 20th century, vernacular Chinese poetry had to be invented, right? We have to wrap our head around this. Like, it wasn't there before. Like poetry was this thing we've just been talking about for an hour or so. This thing that they were doing is something else. It used the same word, but it was called 新诗 or new poetry, to differentiate it. And it was, the expression of a personal ego, in often free verse. There were those who wanted, as you suggested, that were kind of neoclassicists in a way, that thought that a Juechu, that 4-line poem that I was reading, would be a great vehicle for talking to the masses, because everyone knows the form. It's imprinted cognitively into every Chinese speaker. And so why not use something that's there and available? But so strong was the idea of rejecting this, right? That those who wanted to utilize classical Chinese forms to popularize modern nation-state sentiments were outvoted, if you will. So they became small coteries that just kind of shrank in their influence and power over a few decades. By the establishment of the modern nation state 49 under Chairman Mao, when the PRC was established, there's a period of a couple decades there where poetry was very much under the thumb of the Yan'an talks that we talked about, where Chairman Mao said you must only communicate in a certain way to the people. Folk songs were utilized at that time period. People started to memorize and repeat and write to various folk rhythms. And so some of the great anthems of China, like Dongfang Hong Ta Yang Sheng, this kind of Chairman Mao song that's really famous, East is Red, is built on the architecture of a folk song that precedes it. And so that way of kind of yoking modern ideas into the vernacular forms was an important part of that for a few decades. It wasn't until the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s, when you have a poet, his name is Shizhi, or index finger. Shizhi is his pen name, and he took it because it was a finger that persecuted him. His given name is Guo Lusheng, born on the side of the road, Guo. He wrote several poems, but he wrote the first, probably most important, was called Believe in the Future, where he talks about how the Red Guards and these young people should believe in the future. And he was talking directly to other people as himself. Now, if you read it, it might sound, okay, this guy sounds like a Red Guard, kind of upbeat, talking about the kind of sentiments that were popular at the time. But what was unprecedented is that he was actually writing as a human being to other human beings through what would be considered a lyric voice. And so you could think of this guy in the 1960s as the first person who really starts writing in what we would think of as a modern lyric poem. And his work was later picked up in the 1970s and 80s by what are called the Misty Poets, Menglong Shiren, Bei Dao, Gu Cheng, Shu Ting, Meng Ke. These guys became absolute superstars, Joseph. I mean, there's not a lot going on in the early 1980s in the economy and so on. So poetry becomes a social capital, and poetry has this incredible boom in the 1980s. I mean, it's just absolutely amazing. Bei Dao becomes just an absolute legend. And so I highly recommend, readers look into Misty poetry. That's where I keyed in myself to modern Chinese poetry. Was in high school reading the Misty Poets and just completely falling in love with them. And they inspired me to be a poet, a modern poet, because their work was so romantic and so important, so existentially alive. and it felt deeply modern and incredibly personal, and so it's just wonderful stuff. And then the 1990s rolls around, and the economy starts to open up and liberalize. The crackdown on this kind of what's called unofficial verse becomes a little stronger after Tiananmen Square, and you start to see the breaking apart of this group into those who are sort of more like getting jobs as professors, and those who are sort of people who had medial labor jobs and writing poetry of the streets. So they call that the lower body school and the intelligent and kind of intellectual school. And so that was another decade or so of a really wonderful kind of poetry diatribes against one another in the 90s. And then you get to the 2000s, and you have probably the most substantial story was migrant worker poets, people who don't have residency in cities but live there in the shadow world writing poetry. And like the Shijing of old, you get the sentiment of these hidden people and their lives through the poems that become very popular in China. The leading poet there is Zheng Xiaoqiong. I highly recommend her work. And that kind of leads us more. That's been the last big movement in Chinese poetry, and I have to say that during the last decade, poetry, it becomes more and more marginal as the market becomes more and more diversified, and entertainment and other forms of cultural production become scaled, and to the level that we've seen in the West and then beyond. And so I think the space for poetry has shrunk. The social capital of poetry has shrunk. So both the classical Chinese poetry that I mentioned is ubiquitous, but it's everywhere, but sort of disempowered, but revered as something far away and old, rather than something that's vital and real and connecting people to nature and how to be a better person and how to connect to each other. That all these things which are still totally available to anyone who needs or wants them. That I hope that there will be, a reconnection to these old forms because of all that they offer us modern people. But I think when it comes to the modern Chinese, the Xinshi poets, the new poetry poets of the 20th and 21st century, the road ahead looks a lot like it does in the West, which is marginalization, which is a good thing in the sense that it's not capitalized. It's not transactional. It's something that if you love, you participate in. If you don't, you ignore. That provides those who do find this an important part of their lives, deep meaning and human connection with one another, and in a way that's hard to find, even in something like the music industry, right? Because there's the word industry behind it, or within the arts, in visual arts, because there's an industry behind it. Poetry doesn't have an industry
Yeah.
to speak of, and as such, it's really hard to make a living as a poet in China, just as it is here. And I think that probably bodes well for good art and human connection through this art form. But lingering in the shadows, right, is this all other world of all these different things that poetry used to do and still has some capacity to offer us.
Yeah, that's amazing. In your time studying this area, which poet has surprised you most? Whose work came as the biggest surprise to you?
I'll go back to a few that I've mentioned, right? I think for your readers, sorry, your listeners, those who are listening, I think you'd want to look at Bonnie McDougall's translations of Beidao from the 1980s. These are the ones that I would have kind of cut my teeth on because here you have a Scottish translator, University of Edinburgh. Her translations of the Misty Poets from that time period they're just so beautiful in terms of being English poems. And so I would recommend those. In terms of surprise, I think Zheng Xiaoqiong, who I mentioned as the kind of most famous of the migrant worker poets of the 2000s forward, her work is surprising because of the way in which she sometimes builds in some fairly classical flourishes, as well as high literary devices and experimental qualities of her work, which you would expect in a more like an academic or intellectual poet. But the content is heartbreakingly connected directly to the lives of mostly women, on the factory floor who are the precariat. And so that the overlay of those two, I think, are really worth your listeners pursuing further. In terms of classical Chinese poets, there's no surprises here. They, you know, Li Bai and Du Fu, who we talked about, are so incredible and in very different ways. Wang Wei and his Buddhist-leaning poems are, I think, something that your listeners just can't miss out on. Um, I think Li Shangyin is another really difficult and interesting Tang Dynasty poet who inhabits the form in such unexpected ways that really challenges the interpreter of the poem to feel like it's so indeterminate what the poem means in the end that just the act of reading is like composing it yourself. And that could be said of a lot of these poems, because we're moving from a non-vernacular to a vernacular language. You really are kind of writing rather than reading. You're laying out, when you're translating a poem, it's going to be so different from the poem you're reading, the one that you have in your mind or what you think it means. That intimacy is this tremendous relationship that you build with the poets that you're reading. And I would also suggest, that with AI, that your listeners do just, like play with your chatbots in classical Chinese poetry in terms of like asking it to give you literal translations and, what does how does this work, and ask it questions. And, I think that that's a really wonderful way if you're willing to spend that water and human natural resource. Then there's some surprising conversations you can now have about classical Chinese poetry that doesn't require you going to uni or university for.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Well, my last question was going to be what poets you would recommend for the listeners, but
Yeah,
you've already answered that. So
yeah, I think that's right. I will say, let me put a plug in for Shizhi, Index Finger. You can find his book on Amazon. Winter Sun, the name of the book. I'm his translator, and so that you can kind of get a sense of this epochal turn towards the lyric voice and the Cultural Revolution. So Shizhi is I'll go with that. And of course, my main recommendation is jjupath.com. So I hope to read yours, Joseph, your classical Chinese poetry soon, and I'll see if you can make it the Jinshi level.
I'll make sure I put links to everyone you've mentioned there in the show description, so if our listeners can easily find it. Well, brilliant, Jonathan. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. That was really good to hear.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure, and I'll send a couple more notes maybe for the show notes with some links to some other great podcast conversations as well that your listeners can dive into.
Perfect. That'd be really appreciated. Thank you very much. That was Jonathan Stalling. If there are any other topics you would like to hear this podcast discuss, or if you have any feedback, please contact us via the email in the show description. The music is Chopin's Grand Valse Brillant, Opus number 18, produced by Gregor Quendel and released under Creative Commons license. The podcast was written, produced, and edited by me, Joseph Edmonds. Goodbye.